I see Mortal Shell 2 as one of those projects that seem to have stepped up a level without losing its identity. The first game already had an interesting foundation, but it always gave that feeling that it lacked more space, more confidence, and more ambition for the concept to truly breathe. What catches my attention now is that the sequel doesn't seem to be treated as a simple continuation. From what has been shown, there's a clear desire to expand the scale, tweak the world's structure, and give more weight to the core systems, which for me already indicates a much safer development than the original game. I also think it's important that the developer is portraying a more mature project image. When a studio starts talking about a more open world, more content and more freedom, but without sounding like they are abandoning the focus on combat and atmosphere, that sounds to me like someone who understood where the franchise's value lay. At the same time, I confess I maintain a healthy skepticism. Whenever a smaller game's sequel grows too much in ambition, there is a risk of losing the precision that made the proposal work. So, for me, the development of Mortal Shell 2 is interesting precisely because it is trying to level up without seeming like it wants to turn into just any other game. Another point that keeps me attentive is the way they are gradually presenting the game. This gives an impression of control over the project, as if the developer is carefully choosing what to show to build trust little by little, instead of tossing loose promises into the air. From what I've seen so far, I feel that the team is trying to turn Mortal Shell 2 into a more complete, more ambitious, and more competitive product within the genre. Only that this ambition comes with a higher expectation, because now it's not enough to be different. It needs to deliver consistency across all parts of development. Mortal Shell 2 appears to be built as the chance to correct the first game's limitations and, at the same time, show that the series can truly grow. And that, honestly, is the kind of move that leaves me more curious than automatically hyped. The story, from what I've seen so far, gives me that feeling that it doesn't just want to repeat the first game's formula, but expand the weight of this universe in a more ambitious way. Even without spelling everything out, you can feel that there is a larger mythology behind it, and that already wins me over quite a bit. I like when a game of this type trusts in mystery, because it matches the gloomy and somewhat sickly mood that the franchise has. The narrative seems to be built upon this idea of mission, corruption, and discovery, rather than simply throwing you into a sequence of linear events. This seems more interesting for this universe, because Mortal Shell always had a more contemplative and strange vibe. Almost as if the world were telling you the story without needing to speak directly. And honestly, I find this much more striking than trying to force an overly explained narrative. Through the demo and released materials, I feel that the game wants to turn the protagonist's journey into something more ritualistic, almost like a crossing through the ruins of a world that has already lost its own soul. This gives a strong identity to the story, because it doesn't seem to be just about defeating enemies, but about understanding what remains of this place. And this type of approach always works better when the game leaves room for the player to interpret. At the same time, I confess I'm still skeptical about how much the story will genuinely impact me emotionally. The universe is beautiful, the tone is great, and the atmosphere sells the premise very well. But atmosphere alone doesn't hold everything up if the characters and conflicts lack more presence. Until now, what hooked me was more the mood of the narrative rather than a strong bond with the events themselves. That said, I think Mortal Shell 2 seems to be going down the right path by betting on a more enigmatic and less obvious story. For a game of this style, I much prefer a narrative that suggests and instigates than one that over-explains. And, so far, the impression I have is that the developer understands this balance well between telling something and letting the player fill in the blanks. I also think it's important to say that the story seems to match well with the very way the game presents itself. Everything about it passes an idea of decay, weight, and strangeness, so a darker and more contained plot makes sense. When this happens, the result tends to be stronger than a grand story on paper, but out of sync with the rest of the experience. Here, at least in my initial impression, there is a lovely coherence between world, tone, and narrative. My opinion is that the story of Mortal Shell 2 has the potential to be more interesting than the first game's precisely because it seems surer of its own identity. It's not yet the kind of story that I'd say gave me complete chills, but it's enough to make me curious and want to understand more of this world. If the game manages to deliver lore development and dramatic presence without losing that mystery, I think it can end up well above average within the genre. I thought Mortal Shell 2 finally figured out what it needed to improve in the gameplay. From what could be seen in the demo, it looks faster, more aggressive, and much less clunky than the first one. Combat stopped sounding like a sequence of overly careful steps and started feeling like a real brawl, the kind where you need to react all the time. What caught my attention the most was how the game seems to want to let you loose within the fight. The absence of a stamina bar greatly changes the feeling of control, because you stop thinking about energy conservation all the time and start focusing more on the rhythm of the battle. This, to me, gives a more modern look to combat and brings the experience closer to something more fluid and less rigid. I also felt that the game is betting more on smart aggressiveness than passive defense. The parry system, hardening, and the way the character responds to attacks seem tailored to encourage quick decisions, not just caution. This pleases me because it gives combat more personality and less of that wait, hit, retreat, wait again feeling. Another point I found interesting is that the shells seem to have more weight in how you play than just appearance or basic function. From the impression left, it's not just a class swap, it's almost a posture shift within combat. And I like that because it gives the feeling that the game wants to build identity on top of mechanics, not just dark visuals. The part that left me most curious is the overall balance of this new proposal. When a Souls-like game gets too fast, it runs the risk of losing the tension that makes every mistake hurt. But, so far, Mortal Shell 2 seems to be walking a very interesting line, because it continues to deliver that heavy atmosphere, just with a much more lively gameplay. If I compare it to what the first game conveyed to me, the sequel seems much more confident in its own identity. The first Mortal Shell had good ideas, but the execution still felt bound by certain constraints. Here, however, the sensation is of a game that wants to pull you into the action and not hold your hand the entire time. My impression is that the gameplay of Mortal Shell 2 looks like a real evolution. It doesn't just look prettier or more polished, it looks more fun to play, more responsive, and more conscious of what it wants to be. And, looking strictly at what has been shown so far, I'd say the game's greatest merit is precisely this: making you want to jump into the fight instead of just surviving it. Mortal Shell 2 took a graphical leap that left me genuinely impressed. I can say that Cold Symmetry managed to raise the technical bar in a way few people expected. The use of Unreal Engine 5 made an absurd difference in the setting, bringing a density to the environments that the first game lacked. Lighting is, without a doubt, the highlight of this entire visual enhancement. Unreal Engine 5's Lumen system creates a much more realistic and believable contrast. The way light bounces off metallic armor and cuts through the heavy volumetric mist of the environments gives a dark and oppressive tone, without looking artificial. It's the kind of graphic that makes you want to stop mid-exploration just to appreciate the atmosphere. Character and enemy models also received deluxe treatment, largely thanks to nanite technology. The new shells, like Teal and Aerodrim, have a level of texture detail that impresses, and the developer knew how to use this to give more personality to each fallen warrior. You can see the wear and tear on the armor and the grotesque aspect of the enemies with a clarity that is slightly startling, in a good way. Another thing I noticed was how the color palette evolved. The first Mortal Shell was already quite dark, but here they opted for cold, metallic tones that made the visuals much more mature and realistic. The art direction kept the dark fantasy identity, but now with a technical polish that makes the game look like a much higher budget production. What positively surprised me was the optimization, at least in the PC build where the demo was available. Managing to run a game with this high-density geometry and volumetric shadows without stuttering all the time is a relief, especially considering the history of poorly optimized releases lately. Visual fluidity during combat, even with all these heavy graphic technologies enabled, helps a lot with immersion. Of course, we are talking about a demo and edited trailers, but the trailer director himself confirmed that almost everything we saw is gameplay captured straight from the running game. This gives me a lot of confidence that the final product will deliver the visual quality we are seeing. The team, despite being small with around 30 developers, managed to do big league work. My opinion is that the graphics of Mortal Shell 2 are not just an aesthetic improvement, but a narrative tool. Visual realism contributes to the weight of combat and the feeling of being in a ruined and hostile world. If the final version, launching now in August 2026, maintains this level, we will be looking at one of the most beautiful Souls-likes of this generation. My impression of performance is quite positive, mainly because the demo already gave the feeling of a much more stable game than what is normally expected of a beta of this size. From what was shown and reported by those who played, it seems to be arriving with an above-average level of polish for a Souls-like in the testing phase. What caught my attention most was that the game appears to run very smoothly even on strong hardware. without that feeling that the pretty visuals are exacting an absurd price all the time. According to reports from those who tested it, the PC experience sounded surprisingly smooth, with good overall performance and few relevant stutters. This gives me good confidence, because performance in a game of this type is not just a matter of FPS count. It's about control response, hit readability, and the feeling that combat isn't fighting against you. And, in that sense, Mortal Shell 2 seems to be delivering a solid foundation. At the same time, I wouldn't treat this performance as something completely locked down and flawless, because we are still talking about a demo and beta. Reports of initial instability have already surfaced, especially in situations like shader compilation and opening the game, so there is still that normal room for adjustments before the final version. Even so, my reading is that the developers team seems to have taken the technical side seriously this time. What I see so far is a game that doesn't just want to impress visually, but also run in a way that doesn't ruin the experience. And that weighs heavily in an action game so dependent on fluidity. The most interesting part is that performance helps sell the game's own sense of confidence. When everything responds well, gameplay looks more refined, more like a finished product, and less like a work in progress. And, looking at what has been shown so far, Mortal Shell 2 seems to be heading precisely in that direction. The performance of Mortal Shell 2 so far has left me excited, because it looks strong, clean, and well above average for what I'd expect from a demo of this scale. There may still be tweaks until launch, but the initial technical impression is of a game that was born much better optimized than a lot of big stuff out there. I honestly see Mortal Shell 2 as one of those games that arrive already instilling good confidence, even before launch. From what the demo showed and what the developer has been disclosing, it seems to have taken a big leap compared to the first game, especially in combat, fluidity, and the feeling of weight for each action. At the same time, it is still understandable if someone prefers to wait a little, because games of this type always require a certain amount of caution at launch. But, to be quite honest, what has been shown so far looks more like a hit than a risk, and that already puts the game in a very strong position for those who enjoy Souls-likes. The ideal profile here is very clear. Those who enjoy more technical combat, dark atmosphere, dense exploration, and games that try to bring their own identity instead of just repeating a formula. In that sense, Mortal Shell 2 seems much more interesting than most games in the genre that try to grab attention purely through visuals. What makes me look with more interest is that it doesn't just look similar to the first one, but rather more confident, more aggressive, and more refined. And when an action game already impresses in the demo, that's normally a good sign for the final version, because the foundation is there. I think the chance of it being worth a purchase at launch is high. It's not the kind of game that forces you to rush for day one, but it's exactly the type of project that, so far, is selling itself purely by what it shows. So, if someone already likes Souls-likes and was waiting for something with personality, I think it's hard not to recommend keeping a very close eye on it. And to be totally honest, today it looks much more like a buy than a wait.